And it's actually kind of relates a bit to what Kevin was saying, and that's the account of Frank. And it actually seems to be the case that that we can't define Frank well. And I know Kevin's probably pulling his hair out right now. But if we ask the question, like, well, what is Frank? Frank's a perduring object. Okay, well, what is a perduring object? Well, a perduring object is a collection of three-dimensional objects. We're collecting these different three-dimensional objects into one perduring whole. And so the perduring object is the whole. And you say, okay, well, so a perduring object is a collection of spatiotemporal parts. So then what is a spatiotemporal part? Well, it's a part of a perduring object. And so we end up with a circular definition where the perduring object is defined in terms of the spatiotemporal parts, but the spatiotemporal parts are defined in terms of the perduring object. And it's unclear exactly why it is that we would combine these things together. I mean, they're separate and diverse three-dimensional objects with different properties. And we say, well, they're very similar. Well, lots of things are very similar. Two hydrogen atoms are very similar, but they're not identical. And so we wouldn't want to collect different three-dimensional objects that are hydrogen atoms together just because they're similar. And in the same way, Frank, just because he's similar at T2 to T1, it's unclear as to why we're collecting these three-dimensional objects together into Frank. And so on perdurantism, there just doesn't seem to be a coherent account of this perduring object. So one way that B theorists can respond sometimes is they'll say, well, the boundaries of the three-dimensional objects make up the boundaries of the four-dimensional whole. But that doesn't really solve the problem, because why the boundaries of these three-dimensional objects? I mean, they're in different points in space. I mean, we know that we're moving at like 3,000 miles an hour because we're on the planet, and it's moving that fast. And so it's literally at a different space. It has different properties. Why are we collecting together these three-dimensional objects? And I actually think that the reason we do is because we revert back to A theory, where we remember, oh yeah, Frank, he was that guy, at the mall. And we're kind of reverting back to the A theory to get our idea of what Frank is. And it's that A theory thinking where we think of Frank as enduring through time. And then we import that into the B theory. And so I actually think it's quite the reverse. We're actually importing A theory thinking into B theory in order to come up with an account of what Frank is. But if we really reckon with this idea that these are separate and diverse three-dimensional objects, one does not become the other, it's unclear as to why we're cobbling them together into a four-dimensional whole. Why not say that there's a million Franks or a billion Franks or whatever it is? Why say that they're all one whole? It's just completely unclear as to why that would be the case. It seems arbitrary on the B theory. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. It's almost needing to rely something what like Kevin was talking about in terms of like continuity theories of identity, in terms of like mental continuity or physical continuity, which runs into problems.
Yeah, and certainly to say, well, this one is very similar to that one, therefore this one is part of that one, or this one and that one are part of the same whole. Just because they're similar, that seems like that wouldn't be enough. It's like we would need more than that. But if you have any other comments, or I can go to Hats Off. He's got a question.
Yeah, I did, like, in terms of attempting to anticipate an objection.
Mm-hmm.
Could you, like, because like you treat, because I could imagine that like you treat Frank as just the one object, in terms of him perduring through the B theory block.
Yeah, four-dimensional
Like he would
object.
be the one object. Oh, sorry, four-dimensional object. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so could someone just, in terms of identity theory, just say like they're the same because it's the same object?
Well,
like
then
in the same sense.
So then, what is
Okay.
the object, right? Well, the object is the collection of these spatiotemporal parts. Because there's not like, unlike the sponge example where there was a sponge on the back of the screen, there's no part of Frank that's outside of time. There's just these parts. And so if you define the perduring object, well, the perduring object is the four-dimensional whole, which is what? It's the collection of these spatiotemporal parts. Okay, well, what is the part? Well, it's a part of that whole. And so you end up with like kind of the circular
Yeah.
definition. Thank you for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also look at the show notes in order to find a link to our group so that you can join our next discussion. I look forward to chatting with you.